The aim of this lecture is to develop a regimented idiom to explore the normative pragmatics, what corresponds to Fregean force, that the investigation of semantics, the theory of what corresponds to Fregean content, in the consciousness chapters has led us to. And then, in the next lecture, we use it to read the allegories of mastery that Hegel recounts in the self-consciousness chapter. In keeping with the previous lecture, its base is the distinction between normative statuses and normative attitudes. In the idiom of the regimentation, this distinction corresponds to Hegel's distinction between what consciousness is in itself and what consciousness is for consciousness. Where in the consciousness chapters, we're concerned with conceptions of the objects of consciousness, and so the distinction to consciousness between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness. Our topic here becomes the subject of consciousness, consciousness itself. And here too, the distinction of consciousness essentially involves is a distinction not only for us, Hegel's reader, the phenomenological consciousness, but also to consciousness itself. It's the distinction between what consciousness is in itself and what it is for consciousness that I'll model in terms of the regimented distinction between normative statuses and normative attitudes. Hegel also distinguishes, within the domain of what consciousness is for consciousness, between what a consciousness is for another consciousness and what a consciousness is for itself. So, for instance, what the master is for the servant in a different consciousness can at various points in Hegel's story be distinguished from what the master is for himself, and vice versa. This distinction is rendered in the present moment by distinguishing two sorts of normative attitudes in terms of the different social perspectives they embody, attributing a normative status to another, and acknowledging or claiming a normative status for oneself. This additional distinction within the category of normative attitudes is matched in the model by a distinction within the category of normative statuses. This is the distinction between authority and responsibility. It corresponds, according to the interpretation I'll present, to Hegel's use of the terms independence and dependence, Unabhängigkeit and Abhängigkeit, when they're applied to the subjects of consciousness rather than the objects. So the structure is accordingly that first picture on your index, and really everything I'm going to do is in one picture or another. So in the regimented idiom, the model of the paradigmatic normative statuses are responsibility and authority, or commitment and entitlement. The attitudes in question include that attributing those statuses to another and acknowledging or claiming them oneself. I'm claiming that the vocabulary of this regimentation is not far from what Hegel himself uses. Although his usage is broader, I think it maps onto his terminology in the way I suggested. Though the concern of the self-consciousness chapter is ultimately with the subjects of normative attitudes and statuses, those attitudes and statuses also have objects. On the side of attitudes, what's attributed or acknowledged is just statuses of authority or responsibility. One normative subject, X, can attribute authority or responsibility to another, Y. X is then the subject of the attitude. Its normative status attributed is the object of the attitude. And the subject to whom the status is attributed is the indirect object, or the target of the attribution. So, for instance, in Hegel's terminology, one consciousness can be independent or dependent, not only in itself, but for itself, or for another consciousness. In the case of acknowledgements, the subject and the target are the same, not just de facto, but de jure, as part of what it means for the attitude in question, the acknowledgement. Acknowledgements are to be distinguished from self-attributions in just the way that essentially indexical uses of first-person pronouns express, by contrast to contingent forms of self-reference. So, attitudes of acknowledging practical commitments can, in the central case, just be intentional doings. Normative statuses of authority and responsibility also have both subjects and objects. The subject of the status is the normative subject who is authoritative or responsible. The objects are what they have authority over or responsibility for. The topic of the reason chapter is the central case where it's intentional doings that one has authority or responsibility to perform. But my concern here is rather with the equally fundamental case, where what one has authority or responsibility to do, what one is entitled or committed to do, is adopt normative attitudes of attributing or acknowledging further normative statuses. The fact that the objects of normative attitudes can be normative statuses, and the objects of normative statuses can be normative attitudes, means that complex constellations of basic attitudes and statuses are possible. It's in these terms, I'll suggest, that we ought to understand both the Kantian individualistic autonomy model of the institution of normative statuses by normative attitudes, and the Hegelian social recognition model of the institution of normative statuses by normative attitudes, and the way in which the latter develops and elaborates the former, what sort of an Hegel it is. If we start with the two basic normative statuses, normative independence and dependence, as authority and responsibility, and the two basic normative attitudes, attributing responsibility or authority to another, and acknowledging or claiming responsibility or authority for oneself, and think about them in the context of the idea that normative statuses might not be just dependent on normative attitudes, but actually instituted by them, then an important compound of statuses and attitudes becomes visible. Kant's construal of normativity in terms of autonomy is to base the idea that rational beings can make themselves responsible, institute a normative status, by taking themselves to be responsible, that is, by adopting an attitude. His idea, developing Rousseau's, is that so long as the attribution of responsibility is self-consciously self-directed, that is, so long as it takes the form of acknowledgement of oneself as responsible, it's constitutive in the sense that adopting that attitude is sufficient all by itself to institute the status. What is it for the attitude of claiming or acknowledging responsibility to be constitutive of the status of responsibility it claims or acknowledges? That it immediately, that is, all by itself, apart from any other attitudes, institutes that status. As the object of an attitude, as what's acknowledged or attributed, a normative status such as responsibility or authority has a kind of virtual existence. There need not, in general, be an actual status corresponding to that attitude. One subject might wrongly attribute a responsibility to another, or claim an authority she herself does not in fact possess. Kant's conception of normative subjects as autonomous, as I'm reading it, is a conception of them as able to bind themselves normatively by their attitudes, to make themselves responsible, acquire an actual normative status by taking themselves to be responsible, that is, by adopting a normative attitude. In the favored cases, adopting the attitude actualizes the virtual status that is the object of the attitude. The resulting status is not just attitude dependent, that is, where no attitude would mean no status, but immediately instituted by the attitudes. The attitude implies the status. This is what it is to understand the attitude as constitutive. Further, being able to adopt such immediately constitutive self-attributions is itself a normative status. For Kant thinks that rational knowers and agents have the authority to adopt immediately constitutive self-attributions or acknowledgments. And here it's important to distinguish having the authority from having the ability, which is just an aletheic modal can, instead of the deotic normative can. To be a discursive being for him is to have the authority to commit oneself, epistemically in judgment and practically in intention, by adopting a practical maxim. Both of these are undertakings or acknowledgings of responsibility, committing oneself to how things are or how they should be. The authority to make oneself responsible, just by taking oneself to be responsible, might be called the basic Kantian normative status, and I'll sometimes abbreviate that as the BKNS. Being a normative subject for him is being an autonomous agent and knower, one that can be the subject of normative statuses such as responsibility and authority. Furthermore, one is in the end committed to, responsible for, only what one explicitly acknowledges as one's commitments or responsibilities. And for commitments that turn out to be implicit in those acknowledgements as consequences or presuppositions of them. It's that authority to make oneself responsible that, according to Kant, other rational beings are obliged to recognize as the fundamental dignity of rational norms and agents. The basic Kantian normative status is a complex attitude involving status. For it's the authority, a complex status, to adopt a certain kind of attitude, an immediately status instituting attitude, what I'm calling an immediately constituent attitude. This sort of attitude is itself an attributing of a status, in the case of BK and S, exclusively to oneself. Attributing a status such that the adoption of that attitude is sufficient all by itself for the status to be exhibited by the one to whom it's attributed. In Hegel's terminology, it's a way consciousness can be for a consciousness that's sufficient to determine that that is the way consciousness is in itself. For one's consciousness to be that way for one's own consciousness is for it to be that way in oneself. And you have on your handout a picture of autonomy, what I'm calling the basic Kantian normative status. The bulk of the self-consciousness chapter consists of an investigation of the conception of this kind of immediately status-constituting attitude. For the idea of the individual attitudes of attributing statuses that suffice all by themselves, just in virtue of the kind of attitudes they are, to institute the statuses they attribute, is the idea of mastery, or pure independence. What it's purified of is all hint of dependence. That is, all the responsibility that would otherwise be correlative of that authority. And that's the topic of all the allegories of kinds of self-consciousness that are recounted in this self-consciousness chapter. The concept of immediately status-constituted attitudes is an extreme version of what I've claimed Hegel thinks of as the basic idea of modernity. On this rendering of the transition from traditional to modern, traditional forms of life revolved around an appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes. What we can now recharacterize as the authority of norms over attitudes, of how what obligations and authorities there are determine what responsibilities and authority normative subjects should acknowledge and attribute. By contrast, modern forms of life are characterized by an appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, what we can now recharacterize as the authority of attitudes over norms, the ways in which what obligations and authorities there are and what they are answers to the attributions and acknowledgments of normative subjects. The idea that some attitudes can immediately institute the normative statuses that are their objects, that in their case, taking someone to be authoritative or responsible can make them have that authority or responsibility, is, on Hegel's view, a characteristic deformation of the modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses. It's the idea allegorized as mastery. Hegel sees modernity as shot through with this conception of the relation between normative attitudes and normative statuses. And it's precisely this aspect of modernity that he thinks eventually needs to be overcome. In the end, he thinks even Kant's symmetric and reflexive, self-directed version of the idea, in the form of the autonomy model of normativity, is a form of mastery. In Hegel's rationally reconstructed recollection of the tradition, which identifies and highlights an expressively progressive trajectory through it, Kant's is the final, most enlightened modern form, one that shows the way forward, but it is nonetheless a form of the structural misunderstanding of normativity in terms of mastery. So the claim that normative attitudes institute normative statuses goes beyond the mere claim of attitude dependence of normative statuses. But beyond these two is the claim that at least some normative attitudes are immediately constitutive of normative statuses. This sort of taking someone to be committed is sufficient for making that one be committed. Self-consciousness that understands itself in terms of the categories of mastery construes normativity in terms of immediately status-constitutive attitudes. Hegel clearly thinks that such a conception takes the insight of modernity concerning the attitude dependence of normative statuses too far. As we'll see, the form of his objection to all forms of self-conceptions that have the characteristic shape of mastery And that's essentially all the forms of self-consciousness discussed in the rest of the book, not just in the chapter on self-consciousness. The form of the objections is the same. We can think of Hegel's diagnosis of a metaphysical error that manifests itself as forms of self-consciousness, understanding itself in a way characteristic of casting, as having three levels, proceeding from the more to the less abstract. First, it's characteristic of self-consciousness with the structure of mastery to understand itself as being in itself, pure independence. That is, it conceives itself as exercising authority, unmixed and unmediated by any correlative responsibility, that is, normative dependence. This, Hegel claims, is an ultimately incoherent conception. It's something the master can be most for himself, not in himself. As so conceived, the master would be unable to commit himself, for a determinately contentful commitment involves being responsible, at least to the content to which one has committed oneself, in the sense that one makes oneself liable to assessments of one's success in fulfilling that commitment, a judgment being true or an intention being successful, to the normative standards set by the content of one's status. The master cannot acknowledge that moment of dependence as responsibility. Second, as pure independence, the master cannot acknowledge the responsibility of his attitudes to normative statuses, the status dependence of normative attitudes that was, Hegel thinks, a genuine insight of traditional forms of normativity, that is, Geist, albeit one that was expressed and deformed because one-sided, practical conceptions of normativity in terms of the model of subordination and obedience. The question of whether the normative status the master acknowledges or claims, what he is for himself, is what he really is in himself, can arise within the conception of mastery. For to acknowledge facts about what someone is really committed or entitled to, what responsibility or authority they really have, what they are in themselves, is to acknowledge something that serves as normative standards for evaluation of the correctness of normative attitudes, of attributing, acknowledging, or claiming those statuses. By contrast, the master must understand his attitudes as answering to, being responsible to, or dependent on nothing. Finally, as already indicated, the master has a conception of normative force in phrases of the pragmatic significance of statuses and attitudes, what one is doing in becoming authoritative or responsible, and in attributing and exercising authority or attributing and acknowledging responsibility. The master has a conception that leaves no room for the contrasted division of labor between such force and the determined conceptual content of either normative attitudes or statuses. This, I will claim, is the form of the complaint that binds together the treatment of all the forms of self-consciousness, conceiving itself according to the categories of mastery. There is no intelligible semantics, account of content, that's compatible with the pragmatics, the account of normative force, status, and attitude, to which they are committed. A key to this line of thought is that Hegel understands the relations between Freudian force and content, between statuses and attitudes on the one hand, and content on the other, in normative terms of authority and responsibility, is independence and dependence. Developing a lesson he learned from Kant, Hegel takes the notion of content itself to be something that must be understood in terms of the way in which we understand statuses and attitudes to be contentful, to understand them as responsible to and normatively dependent on something determined by that content. So Hegel thinks there's something deeply defective about the idea of normative attitudes that are immediately constitutive of normative statuses, a conception that lies at the core of Kantian understanding of normativity in terms of individual autonomy. Though there's also something deeply right about the Kant-Rousseau development of the self-government tradition of modern metaphysics of normativity, the insight it affords about normative statuses as not only attitude-dependent, but as instituted by attitudes, must somehow be reconciled with the insight that normative statuses are at base social statuses. Hegel's recognition model of the institution of normative statuses by normative attitudes articulates the idea that other regarding attitudes of attributing responsibility and authority, holding other normative subjects responsible, or taking them to be authoritative, are equally essential to the really being responsible or authoritative, having the statuses of being committed or entitled, as are self-regarding attitudes of acknowledging those statuses. The social dimension provided by normative attitudes of attribution is not simply absent from Kant's picture, however. It's true that having the authority to make oneself responsible, to institute that kind of normative status, by adopting a purely self-regarding attitude of acknowledging the responsibility, committing oneself, owes for Kant nothing to its attribution by others. That authority is a status that's constituent of being an autonomous discursive being, a subject of normative attitudes and statuses. And that basic constitutive normative status, that authority, to commit oneself, is not instituted by normative attitudes for Kant. In this respect, Kant acknowledges not only the attitude dependence on ground-level responsibilities, but also the dependence of the status instituting capacity of those attitudes on the normative status that is the authority to institute responsibilities by acknowledging the authority to commit oneself. But that status is an autonomous normative subject, the subject of commitments just insofar as one is able, in the sense of having the authority, to commit oneself, to bind oneself by norms that are binding just insofar as the one bound acknowledges them as binding, is a constitutive kind of dignity. As such, that authority unconditionally deserves the respect of other autonomous normative subjects. They have a duty, an obligation, a responsibility to respect the dignity that consists in that authority, to make oneself responsible by taking oneself to be responsible. So Kant's picture does have a social dimension in which attribution of authority of the basic Kantian normative status, as well as acknowledgement, plays a role. And there's a picture of that labeled the social dimension of the Kantian autonomy. This is a complex interpersonal constellation of basic normative attitudes and normative statuses, in which relations of statuses as objects of attitudes and attitudes as objects of statuses are piled on one another 5 levels deep. As rational beings, we have a standing formal obligation or responsibility, a status at level 5, to respect in the sense of attributing an attitude, level 4, to each rational being as a rational being, the dignity in the sense of having the authority, a status, level 3, which we attribute at level 4, constitutively to acknowledge a status instituting attitude, level 2, responsibilities or commitments, that is, statuses at level 1. Responsibilities or commitments, both doxastic and practical. All these elements Hegel can employ, and they're the basis for him to say that Kant was almost right. He had all the crucial conceptual elements, just not arranged properly. So Kant has the idea that it's a necessary condition of being responsible that one acknowledge that responsibility. That's part of the autonomy idea. And he does leave room for a distinction between explicitly acknowledging the responsibility and acknowledging it only implicitly. For instance, just by being a knower and an agent, thinking, talking, acting intentionally. But one might think, and I think Hegel does think, that this is not yet a full-blooded sense of being responsible. It might well be laid alongside another important, but not yet full-blooded sense of being responsible, that consists simply in being held responsible, a matter of attribution rather than acknowledging. Hegel claims that genuine responsibility requires both these attitudes, arranged as reciprocal recognition, that is, dual attitudes of acknowledging and attributing of the status. His view is what one gets by accepting the Kantian picture, but treating both attitudes, the attribution of authority in acknowledging dignity, as well as its exercise in acknowledging responsibility, as individually necessary and jointly sufficient for the institution of genuine normative statuses. Looking at the diagram of the complex constellation of basic attitudes and statuses that make up the basic Kantian normative status makes clear that although the determined responsibilities at the bottom of the diagram, cognitive commitments to claims and practical commitments to doings, are instituted by immediately constituted attitudes, the authority to do that, which is autonomy, is not conceived as itself instituted by attitudes. And looking at the diagram of the social extension of the basic Kantian normative status, likewise makes it clear that the duty to respect the autonomy of others is also a status that is not itself instituted by attitudes. Being autonomous and having the responsibility to respect autonomy by attributing the authority to commit oneself are both statuses that are not instituted by attitudes, but are for Kant constitutive of the status of being a rational discursive being. That's why for him, a special story needs to be told about how there are two sides of one coin, necessarily intertwined aspects of one conception of such beings. Suppose one accepted the motivations that lead Kant to the conception of the complex of basic attitudes and statuses that is the socially extended basic Kantian normative status, but thought both that all normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes, and that such institution requires not only the attitude of the subject of the status, but also the attitude of some other who attributes it. The latter is the idea that the attitudes of any one individual normative subject can institute normative statuses only when they're suitably complemented by the attitudes of others. According to this line of thought, the respect others owe to autonomous normative subjects is not something added to the authority those subjects have as autonomous to institute responsibilities by acknowledging them, that is, to make themselves responsible by taking themselves to be responsible. Recognition, the recognitive attitude of attributing the authority distinctive of autonomy, is an essential component required to institute that very authority. These are the thoughts that lead from the Kantian model of individual autonomous normative subjects as immediately instituting their determinate responsibilities by their attitudes of acknowledging them, to the Hegelian model of the social institution of normative statuses by attitudes of normative subjects that must be mediated by each other's suitably complementary attitudes. What results from modifying the socially extended complex of basic attitudes and statuses that comprises both autonomy and a duty to respect is a complex of attitudes and statuses that has a different, symmetrical, essentially social structure. At its crudest level, the structure is the next picture. Robust general recognition is attributing the authority to attribute authority and responsibility. This is a very basic constellation of normative attitudes and statuses, and I'm understanding Hegel as taking this to be the underlying metaphysical structure of genuine normativity. All that's shown here of the complex constellation of attitudes and statuses exhibited by the two normative subjects is what corresponds to the top 2/3 of the socially extended basic Kantian normative structure. It does not represent the specific responsibilities and other statuses that each is recognized as having the authority to acknowledge. What is represented is a structure of general recognition, not specific recognition. It represents recognition in the sense of recognizing as, taken to be, a general recognizer. It's what in my first lecture I called robust recognition. This is attributing authority to adopt attitudes that are constitutive of statuses, not now immediately, but in the sense that they institute statuses if they're suitably socially complemented. In order to institute the authority, to institute statuses by one's attitudes, here attributions, one must oneself be taken to have, be recognized as having, that authority by another, whom one in turn recognizes as having that very same authority. The idea is that recognitive attitudes can institute recognitive authority, just in case those attitudes are suitably socially complemented, in the sense that the recognition is reciprocated. Recognitive authority, the authority that corresponds to autonomy in the basic Kantian normative structure, the authority to institute statuses by one's attitudes, is itself instituted by suitably complemented recognitive attitudes. It's only when those attitudes are suitably complemented that they actually have the authority to institute normative statuses. Hegelian recognition, in other words, is what Kantian respect for the authority to institute statuses by one's attitudes. Hegelian recognition is what Kantian respect becomes when that attribution of authority by another is understood as essential to the institution of the authority to institute statuses by one's attitudes. As autonomous, Kantian normative subjects can, in a certain sense, lift themselves up by their own bootstraps. For they can actualize normative statuses that are merely virtual, that is, that exist only as the objects of their normative attitudes. But the authority to do that, the authority in which their autonomy consists, is not itself the product of their own attitudes, nor indeed of the attitudes of other normative subjects who are obliged to respect their autonomy by attributing that authority. Their possession of that authority is just a fact about them, as is everyone else's responsibility to respect it. By contrast, the recognitive authority of Hegelian normative subjects is instituted entirely by recognitive attitudes that correspond to Kantian respect for the autonomy of others. The recognitive status that is virtual as the mere object of recognitive attitudes, that is, of attributions of authority, is actualized according to the recognitive model when and only when the recognizing subject is recognized as a recognizing subject by another recognizing subject whom the first subject recognizes in turn. They don't individually lift themselves up into the normative status of having recognitive authority by the bootstraps of their own recognitive attitudes, that is, attributions of authority. But the recognitive unit they form when their recognition is mutual does lift the attitudes of both. It does promote their statuses, their recognitive authority, that are merely virtual as the objects of their attitudes, up to the level of actual normative statuses. The recognitive statuses are not immediately instituted by recognitive attitudes, but they are instituted by suitably socially complemented recognitive attitudes. This, I claim, is the basic constellation of attitudes and statuses that Hegel invokes under the rubric of the process of the pure rebirth of recognition, of the duplicating of self-consciousness in its oneness. He introduces the topic by saying, quote, self-consciousness exists in and for itself, because and by virtue of its existing in and for itself for another, which is to say it exists only as recognized. End quote. What a normative subject is in itself is its normative statuses, and what it is for itself is its normative attitudes. Being a subject of normative statuses and attitudes depends on being recognized as such by another normative subject. Quote, a self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. Only so is it, in fact, a self-consciousness. This is the step that sees recognition, the successor attitude to Kantian respect, as an essential constituent element of the status of normative self-conscious selfhood that is the successor status to Kantian autonomy. Furthermore, instituting a self in the sense of something with the status of a normative subject requires recognitive attitudes that are symmetric, reciprocal, or mutual. He says, quote, each is for the other the middle term through which each mediates itself with itself and unites with itself. And each is for itself and for the other, an immediate being on its own account, which at the same time is such only through this mediation. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. Here we see the move from the Kantian immediate institution of statuses by individual attitudes to the Hegelian recognitive institution of statuses by attitudes that are socially mediated by the attitudes of others. He says, quote, thus the movement is simply the double movement of the two self-consciousnesses. Each sees the other do the same as it does. Each does itself what it demands of the other, and therefore also does what it does only insofar as the other does the same. Action by one side only would be useless, because what is to happen by both? It's this symmetric recognitive constellation of basic normative attitudes and statuses that he refers to in the very next sentence as, quote, the pure notion of recognition, of the duplicating of self-consciousness in its oneness. It's the basic structure of robust general recognition, in which suitably socially complemented recognitive attitudes institute statuses of recognitive authority. They're normative subjects and the dyadic community that consists of normative subjects who actually reciprocally recognize and are recognized by each other. Quote, the elaboration of the concept of this spiritual unity within its doubling presents us with the movement of recognition. Recognizing another is taking or treating that other in practice as a normative self, as the subject of normative attitudes and statuses. More specifically, in the model, it's the attitude of attributing the status of authority to institute statuses by one's attitudes, when those attitudes are suitably complemented. This is a version of the sort of authority that is Kantian autonomy, differing in the understanding of the constellation of attitudes that can institute, that is, actualize otherwise virtual statuses, as socially mediated rather than individually immediate. Adopting recognitive attitudes in this sense is applying to the one recognized an articulated normative conception of a self, its consciousness of a self as a self. The recognizing consciousness also has that concept applied to it, and it's a recognizing self for a recognizing self. But the self it's a self for, the one that is conscious of it as a self, is not itself, but the recognized and recognizing other self. The self-consciousness that's instituted and actualized for the recognizing and recognized individuals making up the recognitive dialogue is a property that they have as a recognitive dialogue. It's only secondary, and as a result, it's a property of each individual. Hegel refers to the recognitive community of recognizing and recognized individual normative subjects as Geist. He says, quote, this absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence, the I that is we, and the we that is I. His independence is in the model authority, the authority of the several recognitive subjects. It's not immediate authority, it's not pure independence, but authority that's socially mediated by the attitudes of others, who attribute it in recognizing the independent normative subject as authority. Freedom is Hegel's term for the symmetric recognitive constellation that integrates immediacy and actuality of attitudes with their social mediation through the requirement of suitable complementation of attitudes for their institutional authority. Freedom is this constellation of independence and dependence, of authority and responsibility. That last diagram represents only the general outlines of the complex constellation of basic normative attitudes and statuses that is the model of Hegelian recognition being proposed as a successor to the model of Kantian autonomy. For it characterizes only the structure of robust general recognition, the recognitive attitudes that institute the recognitive status of having authority, which requires being recognized as having that recognitive authority. What's left out of that diagram are the specific non-recognitive statuses of responsibility and authority, paradigmatically for ground-level claimings or judgings and intentional doings that Kant took the autonomous normative subjects to have the authority to institute by their attitudes of acknowledgement. Focusing on conditions on possession of the specific normative statuses, we can start with the one that Kantian autonomy emphasizes, namely responsibility. Hegel doesn't want to relinquish Kant's insight that one is responsible only for what one acknowledges responsibility for. He wants rather to supplement it with the thought that it's nugatory to acknowledge a commitment unless one has licensed someone to hold you responsible. Ultimately, this will be a matter of the conditions of determinate contentfulness of the commitment. Unless administered by someone, the commitment isn't determinately contentful. The recognition model requires suitable social complementation of attitudes for statuses that are the objects of those attitudes to be actualized. It follows that, as with the Kantian autonomy structure, attributing a responsibility has to be complemented by the acknowledgement of the subject of the responsibility. One only is responsible, a status, for what one acknowledges responsibility for, an attitude. The status of responsibility, which is virtual in the sense of just being the object of these paired attitudes of attribution and acknowledgement, only becomes actual, a status outside the attitudes it's an object of, when the status attributed is also acknowledged. This is just the other side of the coin of the requirement that for acknowledging a commitment of responsibility to succeed in instituting that status, for it to be constitutive of the commitment it acknowledges, for it to be a successful undertaking of that commitment, a status, someone else must be authorized to hold the subject responsible, to attribute the commitment, adopt an attitude, and must actually do so. Kant does not require this social complementation of attitudes, but thinks that autonomous individual subjects just come with the authority to actualize the statuses that are the objects of their attitudes, immediately, in the sense of not depending on any other actual attitudes. And according to the social recognitive model, the same paired conditions requiring social complementation of normative attitudes to institute normative statuses holds for attributions and acknowledgments of authority. One only has authority, including the authority to institute statuses by one's attitudes, if others take one to have that authority by attributing it. A claim of authority only actually institutes the authority claimed if others whom the authoritative subject recognizes as having the authority to do so recognize that authority by attributing it. Absent others treating one as authority, one's own claim to authority is incomplete. The authority in question is merely virtual, as just the object of the subject's claiming attitude. It's a presupposition of the actualization of determinate statuses that the one who holds the first subject responsible is authorized to do so, and that the recognizing subject takes it that the first one is authorized to acknowledge the commitment. Acknowledging a status such as responsibility is suitably complemented only if some recognized recognizer also attributes it, that is, holds one responsible. And attributing a status such as responsibility is suitably complemented only if it's also acknowledged by the recognized recognizer to whom it's attributed. So the full constellation of basic attitudes and statuses that is the Hegelian recognitive model developed on the basis of the Kantian autonomy model is much more complex, and it can be diagrammed in the one labeled Hegel's recognitive model. Suitably complemented normative attitudes institute normative statuses. I admit your eyes may glaze over looking at this, but it's a visual representation of the story I was just telling you. This is the fine structure of the Hegelian reciprocal recognition model of the social institution of normative statuses by normative attitudes. The top half of the diagram shows the recognitive diagram in which the attitude of acknowledgement of specific normative statuses by a normative subject X, shown as shaded, is suitably complemented by Y's attitudes of attribution so as actually to institute those specific statuses. The bottom half shows the recognitive dyad in which the attitude of attributing specific normative statuses by normative subject X to normative status Y, normative subject Y, shown as shaded, are suitably complemented by Y's attitude of acknowledgement so as to actually to institute those specific statuses. Within each dyad, the reciprocal general recognitive attitudes of attributing authority are included at the top. They differ from those in the previous simplified diagram of reciprocal general recognition only in that the authority that's reciprocally attributed is now articulated into authority, not only to adopt attitudes of attribution of normative statuses, including specific ones, but also attitudes of acknowledgement, in each case constitutively, if suitably complemented. The specific normative statuses instituted by the suitably complemented attitudes are on the lower left of the top dyad and the lower right of the bottom left. What one sees there is essentially the diagram of the basic Kantian normative status of autonomy. Each subject has the authority to institute normative statuses, including specific ones, by acknowledging them. But the differences between the models are, first, all the normative statuses are instituted by appropriate constellations of normative attitudes, constellations in which they're suitably socially complemented. Second, the attribution by others of the authority to adopt constitutive status instituting attitudes, which corresponds to Kantian respect, is an essential element, a necessary condition of the institution of that authority. Third, the whole structure of statuses and attitudes, including other regarding laws, in which the substructure taking the place of the Kantian autonomy structure of statuses and attitudes is embedded, is being taken to be a context sufficient for the institution of statuses and attitudes. The core idea of the recognitive model concerns what's required for statuses of responsibility and authority that are virtual in the sense of being the objects of attitudes of attribution and acknowledgement to be actualized for what things are for consciousness to be what consciousness is in itself. It's the idea that it's necessary and sufficient for the attitudes in question to be an appropriate constellation, to be part of an appropriate constellation of other attitudes. A constellation of attitudes appropriate for realizing their objects is one in which the attitudes of attributing or acknowledging responsibility and authority are suitably complemented by other attitudes. When the statuses that are attributed to another subject are also acknowledged by that subject, and when the statuses that are acknowledged by one subject are attributed to that subject, and when the normative subjects of those symmetric attitudes generally recognize each other, then genuine normative statuses are instituted. To recognize someone in the general sense is to attribute the authority to adopt attitudes that will, if suitably complemented, institute statuses, that is, actualize the statuses that are the virtual objects of those attitudes. At the center of my story has been an account of Hegel's successor conception to Kant's autonomy version of the attitude dependence of some crucial normative statuses, specifically determinately contentful responsibilities, both doxastic and practical. For Kant, endorsements in the form of judgments and practical maxims. Kant combines his development of the characteristic modern idea of the attitude dependence of normative statuses with the acknowledgement of the traditional idea of the status dependence of normative attitudes. For Kant, the authority that is autonomy and the responsibility that is the duty to respect, the precursor, I've said, of the Hegel recognition, are statuses that are not instituted by attitudes. They're postulated as actual authority and responsibility that are not promoted from being from the virtual status of being objects of attitudes that institute them. Hegel's critique of modernity takes the form of a diagnosis of it as opposing a one-sided hyper-subjectivity to the one-sided hyper-objectivity of traditional conceptions of normativity. That normative statuses are attitude-dependent is a genuine insight, but it will be understood only one-sidedly if it's not balanced by an appreciation of what was right about the traditional appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes, the responsibility attitudes owe to statuses, the dimension of authority that statuses exert over attitudes. Kant has one way of combining those insights. Hegel proposes another. The bulk of the discussion in this lecture has been on the side of pragmatics, the study of the normative attitudes and statuses that are the bearers of determinate content. To understand the dimension of status dependence in attitudes, one must look to the side of semantics. For the distinction between phenomena and noumena, between appearance and reality, between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves, shows up both in the form of the pragmatic distinction between attitudes and statuses, and in the form of the distinction between senses and reference, as that semantic distinction is rendered in Hegel's terms. In pragmatic terms, it takes the form of the distinction between what consciousness is for a consciousness, itself or another, and what a consciousness is in itself. This is the distinction between what a normative subject is really committed or entitled to, its actual responsibilities and authority, and what responsibilities or authority other subjects attribute to it or it acknowledges itself. That's just the distinction between statuses and attitudes. Semantically, though, appearances, what things are for consciousness, are the Hegelian analog of Fregean senses. What those senses refer to or represent, how things are in themselves, is the reality that is the Hegelian analog of Fregean reference. Hegel accepts Kant's insight that what a representing, here a sense, an appearance, what things are for consciousness, represents, is what exercises a distinctive kind of authority over the correctness of what is intelligible as a representing, just in virtue of its responsibility to that representing. That is, what the representing is responsible to for its correctness, what provides the normative standard for assessments of its correctness. This is the semantic correlate of the status dependence of normative attitudes, the sense in which what consciousness is for consciousness, a subject's normative attitudes, is responsible to, in Hegel's terms, dependent upon, what consciousness is in itself, what it's really committed to or authoritative about, which accordingly exercises authority over those attitudes. The relation between phenomena as representings, Hegelian senses, and noumena as representings, Hegelian reference, is established by the process of recollection, Erinnerung. That's a retrospective rational reconstruction of an expressively progressive process of experience as explicitation, the gradual emergence through the experience of error for consciousness of how things are in themselves. There's a deep connection between this account of the process by which content is determined, viewed prospectively becoming more determinate, viewed retrospectively as explicitly revealing new aspects of the already determined content that had been implicit. There's a deep connection between this account of the process by which content is determined and the relations between normative attitudes and normative statuses, according to the recognitive model of the institution of statuses by attitudes. To begin with, the context of those content-determining processes on the side of semantics is provided by the recognitive processes that institute normative statuses on the side of pragmatics. As we saw in the discussion of the consciousness chapters in my previous series of lectures, and we'll consider further in the discussion of reason, content determination is the incorporation of immediacy in the mediated form of conceptual content. Specifically, that immediacy takes the form of normative attitudes that subjects actually adopt in the course of experience, in response to collisions among attitudes they find themselves with, both through perception and through inference. Those collisions of attitudes are the experience of error. Acknowledging some commitments normatively requires sacrificing others incompatible with them. That phase of the experience of error, in turn, requires retrospective revisions of one's understanding of the conceptual contents of one's commitments. That is, what is really incompatible with one, and what really follows from what. The final retrospective, rationally reconstructive phase of each cycle of the experience of error enforces to consciousness the distinction between noumena and phenomena, between how things really are and how things merely seem or appear. The form that distinction takes on the side of the subject is the distinction between normative statuses, what one has really committed oneself to in claiming, for instance, that the coin is copper, and normative attitudes, what one takes oneself to be committed to in making such a claim. This pragmatic distinction reflects the distinction between the conceptual contents that are Hegelian reference and those that are Hegelian senses, the appearances of those reference, what they are for consciousness. Thought of from the point of view of the subject, the process of content determination, by which noumena, the reference, the representatives, become something to consciousness, distinct from the phenomena, the senses, the representatives, that the experience of error unmasks as what things are for consciousness, is the emergence of the distinction between what is right with respect to the relations of material incompatibility and consequence that articulate conceptual contents, and what seems right to the subject whose contentful commitments are at issue. And this again is just the distinction between normative statuses and normative attitudes. As Wittgenstein puts the point, if whatever seems right to me is right, then there's no question of right or wrong. Pragmatically, the question of how to understand noumena in terms of phenomena, which we've been addressing semantically, so precisely is the question how it is that attitudes, how things seem to the subject, can institute genuine statuses, which are binding on and beyond the attitudes of the subject. How can mere attitudes be transcended? Compare. How can reference become something to consciousness beyond mere senses, what things are for consciousness? Here we've seen that the key insight motivating the recognitive model is that we can make sense of the distinction of status and attitude if and only if, in acknowledging responsibility, committing oneself, one is at the same time authorizing others to hold one responsible by attributing that responsibility or commitment. They can then be understood as administering a content one has committed oneself to, a content that is not determined just by the attitudes of the acknowledger. To see acknowledging responsibility and attributing authority, the authority to hold one responsible, as two sides of one coin, both articulates the distinction between mere attitudes and genuine statuses, and brings into play the notion of determinate content as what one makes oneself responsible for. This is what the requirement that attitudes be suitably complemented in order to institute genuine statuses does. It makes available determinate contents, and thereby articulates the dimension along which attitudes are dependent upon statuses, in the sense of being responsible to them for assessments of their correctness. Senses as answering for their correctness to reference. The status dependence of attitudes shows up in the recognitive model as a sense in which pragmatics, the theory of normative force, is constrained by semantics, the theory of conceptual content. Statuses are normative noumena, what consciousness is in itself, and attitudes are normative phenomena, what consciousness is for itself or for others. The story about noumena versus phenomena in terms of recollection is accordingly the form of the story about the status dependence of attitudes. Kant, having top-level general statuses, had this aspect of status dependence of attitudes, as well as attitude dependence of statuses, since both autonomy and the duty of respect, a precursor of recognition, are statuses. But what autonomy is the authority to do is to institute statuses by attitudes, which is the form of the attitude dependence of the resulting specific statuses. So Kant divided the labor. Status dependence of general attitudes, including the precursor of recognition, autonomy being the precursor of suitable complementation, as a notion of constitutiveness of attitudes, and the attitude dependence of specific statuses. The statuses and their contents are determined by what's represented. The attitudes can be thought of as senses, which inherit this crucial dimension of representational content from their reference. The content determines what one is really responsible for, the status to which the attitudes answer for their correctness, even though those attitudes institute the status. Responsibility is administered by those one has made oneself responsible to, in endorsing or acknowledging responsibility, those to whom one has thereby ceded the authority to determine what one is really responsible for. If there's no responsibility to others, then in exercising one's authority to commit oneself, one has not succeeded in making oneself responsible for any determinate content. That's the cost of not having responsibility to others, authority of others, relative to one's own authority to undertake responsibility. In claiming that the coin is copper, the commitment I undertake, the responsibility I acknowledge, is not determined just by my attitudes. I've made myself responsible to the actual content of the concept copper I've applied. I've authorized others to hold me responsible, not just according to my conception of copper, what I take to follow from or be incompatible with such a commitment, a matter of my attitudes, but according to the real content of the counter I've played in the public language game. That's what determines what I've really committed myself to, the status I've actually acquired by my performance. The essentially social relations between normative attitudes and normative statuses, both the institution of statuses by attitudes and the dependence of attitudes on statuses, their responsibility to statuses for their correctness, on the pragmatic side of force, and the essentially historical relations between what the contents are for consciousness, phenomena, senses, representings, and what they are in themselves, noumena, reference, what's represented, on the semantic side of conceptual content. Those pragmatic and semantic stories are two sides of one coin, recognitive and experiential aspects of one sort of developmental process. And that final diagram on your hand there is a picture of that. The retrospective, rational reconstructive, historical phase of the process of experience, Hegel's Allegory, explains how on the semantic side, objective conceptual contents, reference, noumena, articulated as laws, facts, and objects with properties, both are to be understood in terms of and serve as standards for assessments of the correctness of the process of manipulating subjective conceptual contents, senses, by applying rules, propositions, and singular terms and predicates in adopting doxastic and practical attitudes. The social character of the recognitive process that institutes both normative subjects and their communities explains on the pragmatic side both how normative statuses, noumena, what self-conscious subjects are in themselves, are instituted by, and in that strong sense responsible to, dependent upon, normative attitudes, that is, phenomena, what self-conscious subjects are for themselves, and how those statuses have authority over the attitudes serving as standards for the assessment of the correctness of those attitudes. This is the dimension of the status dependence of normative attitudes, the responsibility of those attitudes to Hegel's dependence on statuses that balances the attitude dependence of normative statuses. So, in conclusion, the recognitive model is Hegel's way of synthesizing two crucial insights. First is what he sees as the founding insight of modernity, the idea that normative statuses are attitude dependent, has boiled down and purified in the Kant Rousseau idea of autonomy into the idea that at least some normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes. The second is that what was right about the traditional idea, one-sidedly overemphasized by pre-modern thought, of the status dependence of normative attitudes. The idea that our attributions and acknowledgments of responsibility and authority answer for their correctness to facts about what people really are committed and entitled to, what authority and responsibility they really have. The complex social historical recognitive model of normativity is Hegel's way of performing the irotas required to make simultaneous sense both of the institution of normative statuses by normative attitudes and the role of normative statuses as standards for assessment of the correctness of normative attitudes. At its base is the idea that to undertake a responsibility must always be to acknowledge the authority of others to hold one responsible, implicitly to attribute that authority. And explicitly to attribute determinately contentful authority to someone is always also to attribute implicit responsibilities defined by that content, administered on its behalf by others to whom one has made oneself responsible by the original assertion of the authority to make oneself responsible. In the case of the attribution of authority that is general recognition, this includes acknowledging one's own responsibility with respect to exercises of that authority. In Hegel's terms, there is no independence without a correlative dependence, and vice versa. And consciousness is essentially self-consciousness, in the sense that one cannot make sense of what consciousness is in itself, apart from concern with what it is for itself. Further, it's of the essence of the recognitive model of self-conscious normative subjects that, quote, what consciousness is for itself is always a matter of the constellation of attitudes comprising what a self-consciousness, an individual normative subject is, both for itself and for others, in the recognitive community that is necessarily simultaneously synthesized by reciprocal recognitive attitudes, along with those statuses and those individual